Hi, and thank you for coming to my talk. This is a project I did with Isabella De Stefano and Tim Brady in the Vision and Memory Lab at UCSD. A standard visual working memory experiment might involve asking subjects to remember colors in a display like this one. But what if those same colors were embedded in meaningful objects? It seems obvious that it would be much easier to remember the colors in this case. The object identities in long-term memory can serve as a cue to the colors that are prototypical for them, such as a strawberry being a combination of red and green. Effectively, the colors can be chunked together, making the task easier. But when learned regularities, such as the association between colors of an egg, help us to chunk colors together and as a result perform better on working memory tasks, what is actually stored in working memory? Is it purely a placeholder that can allow the colors to be decoded from long-term memory at test, presumably returning generic information about the colors that are usually associated with an egg? Or can the learned association be used to support efficient encoding of the display items into working memory, maintaining sensitivity to the particular color shades in that display? These are two possible views of how chunking can support working memory encoding and retrieval. The ContentFree View is a more standard view within accounts of chunking in working memory, supporting the idea that chunks replace individual items within a fixed working memory capacity. The distributed hierarchical view is the proposal of this talk. The question of what is stored in mind when chunking has been raised in response to findings by Brady, Conkle, and Alvarez in this 2009 study. They showed people colors that were paired together in concentric circles, but were probed individually at test. When the colors were randomly assigned within pairs on each trial, performance remained relatively constant throughout the entire experiment. In a second, patterned condition, regularities were introduced into the pairings, so that, for example, yellow might most frequently occur inside red and blue inside black, allowing participants to chunk these colors using associations that they learn as they learn the regularities. In this condition, performance improved significantly throughout the course of the study, showing that as participants learned the pairings, they could use that knowledge to better hold the items in working memory. And importantly, 20% of the time when a color appeared, it did so in a random pairing, allowing the authors to rule out guessing as an explanation of the results. An obvious question then, which bears on the question of working memory capacity limitations, is whether the improved performance tells us that more colors are being stored in working memory. Huang and O in 2018 used the content-free viewpoint to argue that the Brady et al. Result was due to the individual colors being replaced by chunks on trials where chunking was improving performance. And then at test, the chunk can be decoded into the associated colors that were stored in long-term memory. This allows the Brady et al. Result to be interpreted consistent with the commonly held view in working memory research that we can only hold a fixed number of items, for example 4, in mind at any given time. Instead of peak performance in the pattern condition implying something like that all 8 colors were held in mind, it can be seen as meaning simply that the colors were replaced with 4 chunk pointers. The reliance on long-term memory instead of current trial colors means that this content-free view will predict that any trial-specific details that aren't captured by long-term memory associations will be lost to working memory. On the other hand, our view is that working memory representations are hierarchical and distributed. The chunk pointer can be retrieved from long-term memory and held active in working memory, alongside perceptual information that is held at a different level of the hierarchy. This view predicts that memory will retain trial-specific details that are not regular and so are not available in long-term memory, even when learned chunks are used to boost performance. Our experiments test this idea by including and probing information that is regular and thus can be stored in long-term memory, as well as variable information that is specific to each trial. The first study looks at memory for the color of objects. Participants saw objects in different colors, and then they were probed on one location in a 4 alternative force choice test where they had to know both where the object was and what color it appeared in. As in the 2009 study, we had high probability pairings of object and color hues. For example, the backpack might most often be red, which facilitated chunking of the object and color pairings as participants learned those regularities. But the objects would not always appear in their frequent color, which again allowed us to test for and rule out guessing strategies. And importantly, we also had the items change in luminance randomly on each trial. So while backpacks might usually be red, their luminance was completely random, kind of like how in real life objects will appear in different lighting conditions. This means that some information on each trial cannot be captured by the long-term memory representations, which will allow us to tell apart the two views of how chunking helps working memory. On 75% of trials, the incorrect color in the 4 AFC was a different color hue, meaning that you don't need to know specific luminance information to get the test correct. On the remaining 25% of trials, the detailed tests, the incorrect color was the same hue but a different luminance. So in those cases, memory was being tested for information that couldn't be captured by long-term memory. When all people had to know about the object was its color hue, performance increased steadily throughout the experiment. That is, as they learned that backpacks are mostly red, they were able to use that knowledge to chunk red and backpack together in any display with a red backpack, allowing for better memory for that information in the regular tests. The key question, though, is what happens when we ask them to know more than they could have stored in long-term memory. When using a prior learned association, such as the combination of stapler and yellow to help memory, the ContentFree View suggests that the chunk pointer takes the place of the individual pieces of information in working memory and relies on long-term memory to decode the element into its elements at test. So as you switch from encoding yellow and stapler separately to encoding the combination as a chunk, you should get worse on detailed tests when all of the items match the hue of the learned association. All the items in the detailed test in this example are yellow. The learned association is some generic yellow. And so your long-term memory representation will not help you to decide which of the luminance is correct in this case. In contrast, our view, where on seeing a yellow stapler, you know you were seeing a combination that you've seen before, and you also attend to the trial-specific shade of the stapler, such that both the learned chunk and the trial-specific details are stored in mind, suggests that there will be no decrement on performance in the detailed tests as performance in regular tests improves due to the increased use of chunks. In fact, because we see these chunks as facilitating encoding and retrieval of the perceptual details, we think that performance on these trials should increase as the regularities are learned. So what did we find? Performance on the detailed test actually improved across blocks. So instead of trading off with improvement on regular test performance as you'd expect if chunks were content free, both improved, supporting the view proposed here. One possibility is that perhaps the color object combinations were not learned well enough to become fully content-free abstractions. So we ran another study where we used pre-existing well-learned chunks. We paired letters together so that they either formed non-words or can be chunked together into words such as up. We tested people on both the chunk relevant part, the letters, so knowing that I and F together form the word if will help you know that the letter in this example is I, but also the font, which was totally arbitrary for each letter and so couldn't be captured by any of the chunk information from long-term memory. Consistent with all views of chunking in working memory, we found that being able to chunk letters together in words helped participants know the identity of the individual letters. In trials where letters could be chunked as part of words, memory for the individual letters was significantly better than memory for individual letters in displays in which they could not be chunked together. On every trial, participants were also required to know the specific font of the target letter, a detail which can't be decoded from the word chunk. The ContentFree View would predict that as chunking improves memory, the individual letters get replaced by content-free pointers in working memory, and therefore memory for trial-specific details such as font should be lost. But what we find is that memory actually improves for trial-specific font, as chunking improves memory for individual letters. When letters are chunked and remembered together using a pre-existing word chunk, access to the trial-specific font information improves, compared to when letters are encoded separately, suggesting that when chunking, you were storing not just a pointer to long-term memory representation, which could not help to identify trial-specific font types, but also the structure within that word, and in fact, being able to chunk the letters together improved access to that structure. This supports a view of chunking within working memory as involving hierarchical distributed representations and not merely serving as pointers to offline information. This is a new view of chunking. Rather than thinking of chunks as replacing information they seem to serve to compress to make working memory more efficient, we propose that they actually help to enhance knowledge of the specific perceptual details they map onto, forming representations that contain both types of information. People can see an egg, activate knowledge that it is an egg, while at the same time attend to the specific colors of the egg, and as a result encode both prior knowledge and current perceptual information into working memory at different levels of a hierarchy. We think that this view of chunking as cues that facilitate the encoding and retention of perceptual details as part of representations that are distributed and hierarchical can be an important step in understanding the role of chunking more broadly in visual working memory and perception. In real-world perception, we're able to easily make sense of noisy perceptual information by using prior learned knowledge and associations, parsing difficult images like these into separate contained things and contexts. But we seem to be able to do so without losing that richness of the perceptual input. We have shown here that we still remember trial-specific details even when using chunks to better remember a display, and in perception, we can appreciate the different luminescence of an everyday object like a water bottle while still perceiving it as essentially the same object, suggesting perhaps a similar coactivation of different levels of information for the same object in perception as we're suggesting exists in visual working memory. More work is needed to determine to what extent perception and visual working memory operate similarly in this regard, and to better understand the nature of these representations, especially as they are over continuous visual information, which is quite unlike the discrete verbal information that chunking has mostly been studied with. Can chunks ever be purely content-free abstractions? Our studies claim that at least in some cases, chunks can improve memory without being content-free, questioning accounts which maintain a rigid capacity limit within visual working memory by replacing elements with chunks in the calculation of capacity. But we have not shown that chunks need always be content full. It is possible that in some cases, chunks are so well learned and specific perceptual information is so irrelevant to a task that people might not store the perceptual information at all. For example, in quickly parsing handwritten text, it seems likely that where memory might retain the word, it might not retain much of the handwriting itself. However, you would also expect someone to know basic details such as that it was handwritten and not typed. We still need more investigation to know whether a purely content-free memory is possible. I'd like to thank my advisor Tim and my collaborator Isabella and everyone at the Brady and Stormer Labs at UCSD and to the Cognitive Science Society for putting on this conference. Thank you very much.